What happens when a contestant on Family Feud reveals something so personal, so unexpected, that Steve Harvey has to stop the show mid-taping? Today, on Harvey's Highlights, we're diving into the story that left an entire studio silent. The day a teacher's answer made Steve Harvey put down his cards and walk off stage. If you believe television can still capture real, human moments, the kind that stay with you long after the cameras stop rolling, make sure to subscribe to Harvey's Highlights and hit that notification bell, because this is one story you'll never forget. It was a Thursday afternoon at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The Collins family from Detroit was facing off against the Robinsons from New Orleans. Laughter, energy, and competition filled the air, the kind of atmosphere Steve Harvey thrived in. But what no one knew that day was that one of the contestants, a quiet, middle-aged woman in a navy blue dress, was carrying something in her heart that she hadn't spoken aloud in months. Her name was Miss Clara Collins, and before retirement, she had spent 32 years teaching 5th grade at Franklin Elementary. Steve had noticed her the moment the family walked onto the stage. She had that warmth about her, the kind teachers never quite lose, even after leaving the classroom. As always, Steve went down the line, introducing the Collins family one by one. There was her husband, James, their 2 grown sons, Marcus and Deshaun, and Clara's younger sister, Renee. When he reached Clara, he smiled the way he does when he knows he's about to get a story worth hearing. "Now, Miss Clara," Steve said, "I can tell by that smile you've been keeping folks in line your whole life. What did you do before you got here to the feud?" Clara laughed softly. "I was a teacher, Steve. 5th grade. 32 years. The crowd applauded. Steve nodded, that knowing grin widening. 32 years? Lord have mercy, that's 32 years of kids with sticky fingers and short attention spans. You're a saint." Clara chuckled politely, but her eyes carried something behind them, the kind of weight that humor can't quite lift. Steve noticed it. He always did. The game began like any other. Quick questions, faster answers, and Steve working the crowd like only he could. 2 rounds passed without incident. The Collins family was behind by a narrow margin, but Clara's spirits stayed steady. She clapped, she smiled, but anyone paying close attention could see the flicker of something restrained, as if her mind wasn't entirely in the game. Then came the question that would stop everything. Name something a student might leave on their teacher's desk. The buzzer sounded almost instantly. "An apple," one contestant shouted. Laughter, cheers, applause, the typical rhythm of the show. Another said homework. Another said a note. When it was Clara's turn, Steve looked to her with that expectant grin. "All right, Miss Clara, you've been on the other side of that desk, so you ought to know this one better than anybody. What's something a student might leave for their teacher?" Clara hesitated. Her hands gripped the edge of the podium, knuckles pale. She took a breath, deep, steadying. The studio lights reflected in her eyes. Then she said softly, "A goodbye letter." The crowd went silent. Steve blinked, lowering his cue cards slightly. He wasn't sure he'd heard her right. "A what, ma'am?" he asked gently. Clara looked up at him, her voice trembling but firm. "A goodbye letter, Steve. From a student who's not coming back." The air shifted. The laughter that usually filled the studio evaporated, replaced by something heavier. For the first time that afternoon, Steve Harvey didn't have a comeback. He just stood there, staring at her, the cards in his hand suddenly useless. Steve Harvey didn't say a word for several seconds. The studio, normally alive with chatter and applause, seemed to freeze in time. The only sound was the faint hum of the stage lights. He lowered his cards completely now, his voice soft. "Miss Clara," he said, "you mind telling me what you mean by that?" Clara drew a slow breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she kept her eyes steady on Steve. "I taught a lot of children over the years, Steve. Hundreds of them. Some of them I watched grow up, get married, have their own kids. But there was one I didn't get to see grow up." The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight in her tone. Steve took a step closer. He wasn't the host anymore, not really. He was just a man listening to another person's truth. Clara continued, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. His name was Jordan. He was 10 years old. Quiet boy. Used to draw pictures instead of talking. Every morning, he'd leave me little notes on my desk. Doodles, jokes, sometimes just a smiley face. I kept every one of them in a box under my desk. Steve nodded slowly. That's sweet, he said. But he could feel where it was going. The audience could too. Clara looked down for a moment, then back up, her eyes glistening. Last year, right before the school closed for spring break, he left me a note. I didn't see it until after the last bell had rung. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't a drawing or a joke. It just said, "Thank you for believing in me, Miss C. You were my favorite grown-up." Her voice cracked. And at the bottom, he wrote, "Goodbye." Steve's face fell. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. The audience was silent. No cameras moved. No one dared cough. Clara continued, her tone fragile but unwavering. Jordan passed away that weekend. His mother told me later it was an accident. A car crash on the way to visit his grandparents. He never made it. That letter was the last thing he ever wrote. She paused, holding herself together through sheer will. And every time I walked back into that classroom after, I couldn't look at that desk without hearing his voice. So when you asked what a student might leave for their teacher, she stopped, taking another shaky breath. That's what came to mind. That's what one of mine left. Steve exhaled slowly and rubbed his hand over his face. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something heavy on his stage. But this was different. This wasn't television anymore. This was real. He walked toward her podium, resting a hand gently on it. "Miss Clara," he said quietly, "I don't even know how to move on from that." She gave a small, sorrowful smile. "Neither did I," she said softly. The studio was silent for almost 10 full seconds. Then, for the first time, someone in the audience began to clap, hesitant at first, then joined by others. But it wasn't applause. It was something else. Respect, grief, gratitude. Steve raised a hand and the clapping stopped. His voice was firm but emotional. "Hold on. Stop the game." He turned toward the production booth. "Cut the music. Stop the clock." And just like that, Family Feud, the show built on speed, laughter, and chaos, came to a complete halt. Steve stepped away from the podium and walked slowly toward Clara. His usual swagger, the confident, comedic rhythm that filled the room, was gone. Every step he took felt deliberate, like he understood he was walking into a moment that didn't belong to the show, but to something much deeper. He stopped a few feet in front of her and spoke softly, the way you do when you don't want to break something fragile. "Miss Clara," he said, "you don't have to say anything else if you don't want to. But if there's something you've been holding on to, you can say it here." She nodded once, her lip trembling. The studio lights reflected off the tears she was trying not to let fall. "I just wish I could have told him thank you," she said quietly, "for reminding me why I started teaching in the first place. You spend years wondering if you ever made a difference, and then a little boy leaves you a note like that, and you realize maybe you did." Steve took another step closer and knelt down so he was eye level with her. It wasn't a gesture for the cameras, it was instinct. "Miss Clara," he said softly, "I think you already told him. Every day you showed up for those kids, that was you saying thank you. He knew it." Clara pressed her hand to her chest. "I still keep that note, you know? I laminated it so it wouldn't fade." Steve nodded, eyes glistening. "Ain't nothing wrong with holding on to the good stuff," he said. "That's how we keep people with us." For a moment, the studio wasn't a set. It was a classroom. Rows of silent faces watching a teacher and a man trade the kind of truth that never needs an audience. Clara looked at him and said, "You know what the hardest part was, Steve?" He shook his head slowly. "What's that?" Trying to smile again in front of the other kids, because they were still there, still laughing, still living. And I couldn't let them see me break. But every laugh felt wrong for a while, like I was betraying him by being happy. Steve's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath before answering. "That's what pain'll do to you. It'll make you think joy is disrespectful. But it ain't. You Logan, that's how you honor him." You keep teaching folks to smile, even when it hurts. That's what that boy would have wanted. There was a pause, one of those rare silences that didn't feel empty, just full. Then Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief. He handed it to her, the same way he'd done for guests before, but this time it wasn't a gesture for television. She took it, pressing it gently to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Steve looked toward the production booth and said quietly, "We ain't playing another round today." The floor manager looked stunned, unsure if he was serious. But Steve didn't waver. "Let's give this woman what she deserves." A moment. Then he turned back to Clara. "You said that boy reminded you why you taught," he said softly. "Well, you just reminded everybody why this show matters. 'Cause this right here, this is real life." The crowd stayed completely silent, some wiping their own eyes. The cameras were still rolling, but nobody was thinking about ratings anymore. The cameras were still rolling, but the game was gone. The buzzers, the boards, the sound cues, all of it suddenly felt small compared to the weight of what had just been shared. Steve stayed where he was, still kneeling beside Miss Clara. Then he stood slowly, turning toward the audience, his voice low but steady. "Let me tell y'all something," he said. "You don't get moments like this on television. You can't script this kind of truth." He looked back at Clara. "You said that boy reminded you why you taught. Well, I think you just reminded all of us why we need teachers like you." The audience began to applaud softly, not the usual cheers and whistles, just a quiet, respectful rhythm that filled the room like a heartbeat. Steve waited for it to fade, then turned to the families standing behind the podiums. "We're not gonna play the next round," he said. "We're gonna do something else." He motioned for the Collins and Robinson families to come forward. They exchanged puzzled looks, unsure what was happening, but they obeyed. Within seconds, both families were standing together at the front of the stage, side by side. "Today," Steve said, "we're not two families going head to head. We're one big family. And we're gonna do something for that little boy, Jordan. We're gonna make sure he's remembered." He paused, glancing over at Clara. "Miss Clara, you said he used to draw for you, right?" She nodded. "Every day." Steve looked over his shoulder toward the production crew. "Y'all still got those little notepads backstage we use for rehearsals?" A stagehand hurried off and returned with a stack of plain white pads and pencils. Steve took them and started handing them out to the contestants and audience members in the front row. "Here's what we're gonna do," he said. "Everybody in this studio, write down one thing you'd want to tell somebody who made your life better. Could be your teacher, your mama, your friend. Don't matter who. Just write it, and we'll put 'em all together for Jordan." The studio was silent except for the soft scratching of pencils on paper. Steve stood quietly, letting it happen. People wrote. Some smiled as they remembered. Others cried quietly as they put their words down. When the last page was filled, Steve collected the stack and handed it to Clara. "You keep these," he said softly. "Every note in there belongs to you now. You gave this moment to all of us. It's only right it comes back to you." Clara took the bundle with both hands, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Steve turned to the audience. "That's what family looks like," he said. "It don't always come from blood. Sometimes it's a bunch of strangers in a studio who stop everything to remember a little boy who drew pictures and made the world better for one teacher." The crowd stood, clapping softly again. The families embraced. There were no winners, no losers, no prize money announced that day. Just an entire room of people holding on to something bigger than the show. When the taping ended, Steve walked over to Clara one last time. "You said that letter was goodbye," he told her. "But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was him saying thank you one last time, not to end something, but to remind you it mattered." She nodded, tears falling freely now. "Maybe so," she whispered. Steve put a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll make sure he's never forgotten." And for the first time in the history of Family Feud, the host, the contestants, and the audience bowed their heads together. Not for a prayer, not for a cue, but for a boy named Jordan who had written one final note that reached further than he could have ever imagined. The episode never aired in full. The network chose to release only a few select moments, the laughter, the smiles, the applause, but not the part that made the world stop. Those who were in the studio that day said it was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Some left the taping in tears. Others stayed long after the cameras stopped, unable to shake the feeling that something sacred had happened right there, on a soundstage built for laughter. Weeks passed, then months. Family Feud went on as television always does. New families came, new jokes were made, and new answers filled the board. But for the people who were there that afternoon, for Steve Harvey, for Miss Clara, for the Collins and Robinson families, something inside them had shifted. Then one morning, nearly 6 months after that day, a package arrived at a small elementary school in Birmingham, Alabama. The front office called Miss Clara to come pick it up. It was a simple brown box, no return address, just a white label that read, "From your Family Feud family." Inside was a framed collage of handwritten notes, the same ones the audience had written during that taping. But in the center was something new, a small sketch drawn in pencil. It was a child's drawing of a teacher at a desk with a student handing her a note. Taped below the drawing was a short letter, written in Steve Harvey's unmistakable handwriting. "Miss Clara, you reminded us that what happens off the board matters more than anything that happens on it. Jordan's story didn't end that day. It started something in all of us. Keep teaching, keep loving, keep remembering. The world needs more people who see the good, even in goodbye. Steve." Miss Clara hung the frame behind her desk that same day. Her new students didn't know the full story, but they always asked about the drawing in the center. "That," she would say softly, "was from a boy who taught me more than I ever taught him." And every year since, on the anniversary of that Family Feud taping, Steve Harvey has sent Miss Clara a single white envelope with a note inside that simply reads, "Still teaching, still remembering, still thankful." Inside the studio, among the crew and contestants who were there that day, the story of the teacher and the letter became something of a legend, told not for ratings or fame, but as a reminder of what television can be when it remembers the people behind the lights. To this day, Steve still keeps a single folded sheet of paper in his inside jacket pocket, the same one that Miss Clara showed him on stage. The paper is worn now, the ink fading, but the message remains clear. Thank you for believing in me. If this story made you stop and think, if it reminded you how powerful a single moment of honesty can be, take a second right now to subscribe to Harvey's Highlights. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what you would have done if you were in that studio, or what that note means to you after hearing this story. And make sure to stay tuned. The next story on Harvey's Highlights is one you'll never forget. Until then, remember the line that stayed with all of us. The game can always wait. The heart cannot.